Nature without humanity, existentialism and modernism. World War I, and arguably industrialization and the Great Depression, forced society out of its ignorance in order to see the world as it truly exists, and not through the perceptions of shared humanity. Strictly speaking, World War I did not create the helplessness and hunger people were experiencing, but rather prompted the world to realize that these feelings were always present, yet often hidden and ignored. The assumed truths of religion and purpose were no longer absolute. How can God allow such a travesty to occur? How can a person find purpose when all they know is death, destruction, and murder? Thus, the ideas aroused by the war prompted the beginning of a new literary movement, which focused on a painful hungering for ideas and experience swallowed by the past, the notion that nothing could be expressed or communicated, and an unyielding feeling of isolation and alienation. A portion of the modernist movement aimed to express and illustrate the nothingness of existence. For many years, events such as World War I and the Great Depression provided modernist writers with experiences that did nothing but feed their pessimistic perceptions regarding life. According to Becca Weir, author of the article Degrees in Nothingness, Battlefield Topography in the First World War, persons in the interwar period were, quote, trying to get a fix on an empty space, end quote. In other words, the people who made up the lost generation were simply trying to understand the emptiness they felt and comprehend how the desolation within themselves could never be filled. In regards to literature, the traditional canon that possessed romantic views of nature, love, and life no longer satiated a group of people who were longing for purpose and attempting to understand the new reality that had been revealed through war. Modernism was born in an attempt to create a canon of literature and art that illustrated the hollowness which was present worldwide. For many modernists, the only answer was to embrace the void. This could not be done by living. There was no point to the process. The idea of living assumed purpose. Thus, the true nihilist could do nothing but give in to despair. Nevertheless, as all major literary movements change and evolve, modernism was no exception. New minds generated new ideas for the movement and questioned the components of nihilism and the void. The author of The Historical Conditions of Possibility of the Rise and Fall of Sardian Existentialism and Existentialist Marxism, Philip Wood, suggests, quote, all entities in the object world are reorganized and reprocessed in terms of exchange value. Eventually, the lowest common denominator of all entities emerges for the astonished beholder of the process. Pure being, end quote. What Wood suggests is the first modernists focused on the nothingness and insignificance of the world, while later modernists asked why nothing had purpose or meaning. Pure existence is the answer. Humans are creators of meaning and purpose, but life continues even without perceived meaning. When the individual examines his or her life and attributes meaning to the experience, the person is simply covering up the terrifying notion that the person has no other purpose than to simply be. Thus, existentialists took the ideas of nihilism and delved deeper into that philosophy and focused on the very nature of existence and of humanity versus the individual. As a result, writers such as Jean-Paul Sartre shook the very foundation of nihilism by attempting to answer the questions the philosophy raised. The major idea which Sartre presents to his readers forms through the acknowledgement that life is meaningless and that one cannot truly know anything, learn anything, or love anything, and additionally attempted to determine what happens after a person acknowledges these ideas. Sartre's novel Nausea is an exploration of his existential views regarding existence and the individual's responsibility of free will. Nausea, and thus the demonstration of Jean-Paul Sartre's existential philosophy, offers a response to the nihilistic perceptions associated with the modernist movement. By attempting to continue past the oppressive nature of the nothingness that surrounds existence, Sartre's novel aims to explore nihilism and many tenets of modernism while also attempting to move past the hopelessness associated with nihilism. In order to illustrate existentialism's relationship with modernism, it is important to first focus on the several major components of the existentialist philosophy. Hayden Carruth, in his introduction to Sartre's Nausea, connects the philosophy with the literary movement by stating, quote, "The mind of a man, which he did not ask to be given, demands a reason and meaning. This is its self-defining cause, and yet it finds itself in the midst of a radically meaningless existence." End quote. This notion ultimately activates the despair found in many people during the interwar period because, as creatures of thought, humanity has the capacity to think beyond existence and attribute meaning to its surroundings. However, both nihilist and existentialist agree that one's capacity to surround oneself with meaning creates a false reality and hinders his or her objective existence. Examination of one's life does nothing but create a false sense of purpose and removes a person from the life which actually exists. In other words, life has no meaning. Reality is simply meant to exist, and creating meaning from one's experiences means nothing to a universe that lacks the ability to judge a person based on the reality they construct. Carruth considers the human ability to attribute meaning to objects and experiences an evolutionary misstep and a, quote, non-essential component of reality. In other words, there is a disconnection in meaninglessness to time and the essence of all things within existence, including humanity. This idea is illustrated throughout Nausea through the protagonist's, Antoine Roquentin's, interaction with objects. At the beginning of the novel, Roquentin first experiences the nausea when attempting to skip a stone in a lake. He later realizes the nausea came from his inability to attribute meaning to the stone. He could only acknowledge its existence. Thus, the nausea was the feeling of anguish and despair regarding the ever-growing realization of the emptiness of things, of people, and of life. Consequently, the worthlessness of reality causes a feeling of alienation in all people. The anguish of oblivion goes hand in hand with nihilism and existentialism and leaves the individual alone to sort out existence. However, where the works of nihilist writers in modernist literature focus solely on the hopelessness of an existence void of meaning, the existentialist works around the later years of the modernist movement attempted to move past this emptiness. In this way, Bernard Freckman, who introduced Sartre's essay entitled Existentialism, suggests, quote, "The chief effort of Sartre in his short work is to face squarely the implications for personal actions of a universe without purpose." He continues by stating that the singular man holds all responsibility of his actions and nature, and thus humanity cannot be defined by collective human nature. Thus, while the universe may hold no purpose, the individual assumes the responsibility for making purpose for oneself. Antoine Roquentin illustrates this by accepting his role in his existence and attempts to create purpose by writing a novel. In other words, he attempts to create a fictional work which the only truth it possesses is that which the reader, the individual, perceives. As a result, quote, "Existentialists insist that reality is only what the individual knows and experiences. Therefore, the individual cannot know any form of truth or any form of essence of another person, because the individual can only project his or her own thoughts, experiences, opinions, and realities onto another person." Sartre demonstrates this concept in the early pages of Nausea when Roquentin examines his face. Quote, "I can understand nothing of the face. I cannot even decide whether it is handsome or ugly. I think it is ugly because I have been told so, but it doesn't strike me. At heart, I am even shocked that anyone can attribute qualities of this kind to it, as if he called a clod of earth or a block of stone beautiful or ugly." End quote. Through the questions this passage raises, Roquentin and ultimately Sartre call to mind the fallacy regarding the notion that society or a person can impose norms on another. Sartre suggests through this passage that societal and cultural norms are essentially centered on baseless perceptions of subjective experiences and provide no objective contributions to existence. The existentialist, therefore, argues that the past and the future are meaningless due to the same notion. One's knowledge of the past is dependent on the reality the individual creates, and therefore cannot be considered truth. The future's unpredictability forces it into this category of meaninglessness as well. Thus, only the instantaneous present exists. Furthermore, this present is so quick that one cannot help but simply experience it. By the time one attempts to examine the present, it has already become the past. Thus, essence is meaningless, as is one's concept of humanity and self-identity in turn. This belief is illustrated in Nausea when Roquentin establishes that all he had written and done were in the past. These experiences were not so much out of reach, but rather out of existence. The past could not affect him because it no longer existed. From this realization, quote, true nature of the present revealed itself. It was that which exists, and all that was not present did not exist, end quote. Antoine discovers that he simply cannot uncover the lives of those who once existed. He determines that any information he writes is simply fabricated from his experiences. As he attempts to study the life of the Marquis de Royabon, he realizes that the bits of information that can be found on the man are cryptic or were, quote, composed by the public scribe, and thus ultimately detached from the Royabon's identity. Since all Roquentin can accomplish in his writing is a series of conjectures, he admits that he would be, quote, better off writing a novel on the Marquis de Royabon, end quote. These ideas of hollowness regarding time and people were nothing new. Many modernists were already aware of this nothingness that surrounds everything. The concept of nihilism provided this mindset. However, as Carruth states, quote, existentialism is a philosophy that has been independently invented by millions of people simply responding to the emergency of life in a modern world, end quote. Thus, from nothingness, quote, comes despair, but also, if he has courage, his existential integrity, end quote. In other words, existentialism begins with the acknowledgement of meaninglessness, but if the individual can move past this despair, those who cannot embrace the pointlessness of existence by relinquishing their grasp on life, they find the ability to ask, where do I go from here? The answer to this question is limitless and presents another major tenet of existentialism. The suggested futility of life proposes equal insignificance to social norms, laws, and expectations. Sartre asserts, quote, man is nothing else but what he makes of himself, end quote. Based on the assumption that God does not exist, one can concede that human nature cannot exist in the way that suggests that all humans possess a shared experience. Therefore, the individual is the only one that holds responsibility for defining his or herself. As a result, the individual is subject to nothing and no one except for free will. However, this free will forces upon the individual the responsibility for his or her own actions. In the end, one of the biggest differences between existentialism and nihilism is the idea that the existentialist feels the individual has a responsibility to act and exercise their free will. In turn, this responsibility forces the individual to define oneself through his or her actions, and not through the perceptions of others or an examination of the past. Existentialism acknowledges many of the tenets of nihilism, but proceeds to ask, quote, where does one go from here, unquote. Thus, existentialism provides a unique look into the modernist movement and illustrates its progression throughout the years. While I would argue that existentialism contains several postmodernist themes, I still find it a useful component to modernism, and that the ideas presented in Nausea, and in turn existentialism, such as the concept that nothing can be communicated, as well as the notion that life is futile, remain at the forefront of both modernism and existentialism.